We continue with our discussion of The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. This is the third part of our interpretation. This book's logic is tricky, but worth the effort. We want to know how human society went from fairly equal to unequal, even despotic. If you care about more than just your family's basics and feel any responsibility for humanity, understanding why oppression exists is key. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors lived a dual-system life. They knew despotism well and actively avoided it. So how did inequality stick? Some say agriculture. It makes sense. Agriculture enables lasting despotism. Hunter-gatherers couldn't hoard wealth, fruits, and prey spoil fast. Grain, though? It stacks up, stores well, travels easy, and yields are predictable. Perfect for taxing. Taxes let elites hog labor long-term, locking in classes and birthing countries. But Graeber and Wengrow argue blaming agriculture for class society is like blaming calculus for the atom bomb. A necessary step, but way too distant. From the first Middle Eastern farmers, it took 6,000 years for early states to rise. Archaeologists show many tried farming, then ditched it. Look at China's history. Steppe nomads and Central Plains farmers. No nomad ever said, "I'm done with horses, I'll farm." Unless forced, no one picks farming. Even pre-Manchu nomads were fairly equal and democratic. Slaves did the farming. From dual systems to fixed inequality, the shift is subtle. Graeber and Wengrow's answer surprised me. It ties to today's big theme: identity politics. Inequality might stem from our mental lives. First, the material side. All evidence says early humans lived pretty richly. Sure, they lacked medicine, but wealth is relative. If light work meets all your needs, you're rich. Nature gave hunter-gatherers a universal basic income. Daily work was like quick shopping, requiring little time or effort. Even today, some surviving hunter-gatherer communities live in marginal environments like desert fringes, yet they still only work 2 to 4 hours a day. Most days are for chatting, games, dancing. We should be ashamed. Work hours keep growing. Even medieval serfs clocked less than today's 9 to 5 grind. Ethnographies and archaeology evidence also suggests another aspect of early life worth envying. Individuals could travel long distances alone. Back then, large social networks spanned thousands of kilometers, and travelers could expect hospitality wherever they went. Imagine someone having a dream that called them to a distant place. They could simply set out on an adventure, meeting all kinds of people and experiences along the way. Many young people can probably relate to this impulse. This meant people could leave home without worrying about survival. More seriously, it meant they had the freedom to migrate. Think about this situation. Even if a tribe had a chief or authority figure, oppression could never be too severe. After all, if you didn't like it, you could just leave. The freedom to migrate ensured that authoritarian rule remained temporary. During hunting season, people followed orders, but after the bonfire party, they returned to egalitarian life. Because no one could force them to obey. Some people still have this freedom today. When Donald Trump was elected president, several celebrities announced they were leaving the U.S. But for most modern people, leaving home is difficult. Some scholars argue that this ability to leave, this autonomy, is the most fundamental form of freedom. It means you can shape your own life, and therefore, you see yourself as equal to others in your community. You obey a leader only if you truly want to. No one can oppress you. Perhaps the reason modern workers feel so oppressed is that they lack the freedom to simply walk away. Graeber and Wengrow set out to study the origins of inequality, but the more they researched, the more they realized that what truly matters is not equality, but freedom. Without freedom, there is no equality. Of course, human nature includes selfishness, so the seeds of oppression were always present. But as Christopher Bohm noted in our last video, human societies always develop mechanisms to suppress oppression and maintain some level of justice. There is a balance between oppression and resistance, though it occasionally tips in one direction. Early humans saw food, shelter, and resources as gifts from nature, not private property. Hunters never hoarded their catch. Everyone shared. Even if they hunted in the same forest repeatedly, they never claimed it as exclusive economic territory. What a joke! Everything belonged to the gods. They were merely caretakers. We can imagine that, if universal basic income became widespread in the future, people would become indifferent to everyday material possessions. But spiritual wealth? That was different. The only true privileges, the only exclusive possessions, existed in religious rituals. Everything else was shared, but ritual performances and sacred objects were strictly personal. Someone might sew a special religious symbol onto their cloak, and others couldn't. Adult men could own unique sacred items, kept hidden and untouched by others. Ritual knowledge, incantations, healing practices was reserved for shamans. Hunter-gatherers shared tools and weapons, but sacred objects were non-negotiable. Perhaps this is the origin of the idea that private property is sacred and inviolable. Only the sacred is untouchable, and what is untouchable is private. And, of course, the most sacred things were only for a select few. So far, we've discussed social norms shared by all early humans. But how people competed for sacred items varied across regions. One particularly interesting story from the book is about indigenous groups on the North American West Coast centuries ago. They were divided into two distinct cultural zones. The Northwest Coast, now part of Canada, and California, now part of the U.S. Both regions had similar natural resources, abundant fish in the ocean, nuts on land, making them wealthy areas with high population densities. In the Northwest Coast, people relied heavily on fishing. Fish provided high-protein, high-calorie food with minimal labor. Life here was relatively luxurious. Chiefs accumulated vast stores of food and sacred objects and frequently hosted potlatches, feasts where they displayed their wealth and generosity, hoping to secure continued support. This also served as an opportunity to introduce their sons as successors. There was no formal inheritance system, but those who frequently hosted feasts naturally gained public favor. In an egalitarian society, support could shift at any time. The Northwest Coast people favored extravagant clothing and lavish feasts, and they tended to be more robust in stature. By contrast, Californians lived deliberately simple lives. Though skilled fishers and hunters, they primarily relied on acorns and nuts, lower in nutrients than fish and requiring laborious grinding before consumption. Why? Californians, much like the Puritans in Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, took pride in hard work, despised waste, and considered obesity shameful. They valued self-sufficiency and avoided dependence on others. They accumulated wealth, not to start businesses, but to acquire sacred items like rare animal pelts and obsidian knives. These were displayed discreetly at gatherings, never flaunted. Simply put, Californians resembled modern individualists, while Northwest Coasters lived more like a courtly society. Despite similar environments, they made vastly different choices. Why? Graeber and Wengrow argue that this was an intentional choice based on values. The key question was whether to have slaves or not. Living off fish provides good nutrition, but you can't go out fishing every day. The usual practice was to catch a large amount at once, process it, store it, and consume it over time. Processing fish required significant labor. The people of the Northwest Coast were happy to eat fish, but they were unwilling to do the hard work involved. Chiefs, even more so, refused to participate. The labor came from slaves. You couldn't enslave your own people. After all, everyone was considered equal, and they were all close relatives or neighbors. Instead, you had to wage war against other tribes and turn captives into slaves. As a result, the Northwest Coast operated as a war economy, with slaves making up a quarter of the population. This was different from most other indigenous societies in the Americas. For instance, as discussed earlier, the Wendat people assimilated captives into their society, granting them equal rights. If captives refused to integrate, they were executed, but there was no institutionalized slavery. The indigenous people of California, in contrast, deliberately chose not to have slaves. They were aware of how the Northwest Coast people lived, but they saw that way of life as dangerous. Choosing to enslave others meant choosing war, and choosing the risk of retaliation. A local legend even warned that the white colonizers were the descendants of former slaves returning for revenge. The people of California did not want to live that way. They made a moral decision. No slavery. They took pride in doing their own work. So, why did the people of the Northwest Coast accept the convenience and risks of slavery, while the people of California firmly rejected it? The answer is that there was no special reason. It was simply a cultural choice. A French sociologist and anthropologist, Marcel Mauss, 1872–1950, proposed that culture is essentially made up of structures of refusal. In other words, a culture differentiates itself by deliberately being unlike others. For example, the Athabascan people of Alaska refuse to use Inuit kayaks, even though these kayaks are better suited to the environment. Conversely, the Inuit refuse to wear Athabascan snowshoes. This might seem trivial, but it's a fundamental aspect of human nature. On this channel, we've discussed a phenomenon called the narcissism of small differences. For instance, students from Peking University will go to great lengths to explain how they differ from students at Tsinghua University. But to an outsider, the similarities between the two schools far outweigh their differences. Yet, emphasizing these differences is essential for a strong sense of identity and pride. This is likely the origin of identity politics. Once differentiation begins, it tends to escalate in increasingly extreme ways. Identity politics and globalization are, in fact, opposite forces. Surprisingly, identity politics emerged long before the agricultural revolution. During the late Paleolithic period, human cultural regions were vast. From the Alps in Switzerland to the steppes of Mongolia, archaeologists have found evidence that people used similar tools, played the same musical instruments, and shared similar sculptures, jewelry, and burial practices. It was a time of unity. Early humans could migrate freely. DNA analysis suggests that social groups did not strongly emphasize blood relations. In larger settlements, biological kinship accounted for only about 10% of social connections. However, around 12,000 BCE, everything changed, as if the Tower of Babel had collapsed. Cultures began to diverge dramatically. Some communities specialized in fishing along the coast, others gathered nuts in the forest, and some tracked large animals inland. Clothing, dances, medicines, and even hairstyles became increasingly distinct. Some indigenous peoples on the east coast of the Americas experimented with agriculture, while those on the west coast firmly rejected farming. The people of the northwest coast used slaves, while the Californians adamantly refused to. There were no strict economic constraints, just a conscious choice to be different. This led to a situation where each cultural region controlled a smaller and smaller territory. Now, if you were unhappy with your leader and wanted to leave, it was no longer so easy. Especially when the leader owned slaves. That's it for today's content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.